Welcome to Christ&Culture. This is Pastor Jeff Short, your Bible teacher and cultural analyst. And today we're going to be picking up a topic that I recently ran into an article on the internet by John Stonestreet on Breakpoint, which originally started with Charles Colson, little 5-minute or 3-minute actually radio segment. And after his passing, John Stonestreet took over and now runs that briefing, Breakpoint briefing every day. And he has an article out on Constantine, or Constantine, however you'd like to call that. It's the same with Augustine or Augustine, but let's just call him Constantine. And there's a debate going over whether Constantine was actually a net positive or a net negative in Christianity. Now, it depends on who you're talking to. It depends on what their religious background is and what their church membership is. Because, for example, Constantine was and still is a saint in the Eastern Orthodox Church. And so they look up to him with a lot of respect and actually a lot of reverence because he was one of their great heroes. Was he a great hero? Or if you go swing around to the other side and take a more of an Anabaptist perspective, I can think of no one better than John Wesley, who actually was not an Anabaptist. He was an Anglican all his life, except he started a movement called the Methodist movement, which eventually became a church denomination in its own right. But he was very strongly against Constantine because he felt that Constantine was actually a corrupter of Christianity. And so we'll get into that. So where do we stand on Constantine? And should we be thanking God for Constantine, or should we try to set the record straight and say this man really doesn't deserve to have all of the accolades that he's actually receiving? So it's a complicated issue, and we need to get into it. And let's do that today. And let me fix this here. Here we go. All right, we're back to normal. And so John Stonestreet has written an article. Now, why is he writing this article? Well, he's writing the article today because it says that 1,700 years ago, Constantine defeated his co-emperor Licinius, ending a series of civil wars and consolidating power as sole emperor of Rome. At the time, Christians saw this as the defeat of the old pagan ways and the triumph of the new Christian vision of Rome. So he's going to go into a little bit of a historical background, and that's important too, because unfortunately, a lot of pastors and a lot of churches, even a lot of Christian institutions and ministries, they don't go into church history. And this is really the case in the Protestant side of Christianity. It's almost as if we want to run away from church history. It's almost as if we want to ignore church history. We want to sweep church history under the rug. And if you're part of a, for example, seeker church, mega church, big, huge auditorium filled with people, live worship band, sort of like a TED Talk setting, if you're part of one of those churches, you will never, ever hear about church history. You will never hear about Constantine. You'll never hear about Augustine. You'll never hear about people that were very, very important in the development and history of Christianity. You'll never hear about Luther. You'll never hear about Calvin, Zwingli, the Council of Trent, what happened there? The Council of Nicaea, what happened there going back? You'll never hear about people like Justin Martyr and all kinds of early first century called the Church Fathers. You'll never hear about them. You will barely even be able to trace back beyond, say, the 1950s. You may hear about Billy Graham once in a while. But once you go past Billy Graham, it's almost like a lot of these modern churches, they want to ignore everything in church history. They don't want to talk about any of the historical developments in the denominational history. They don't want to talk about the Reformation. They don't want to talk about the medieval church. They don't want to talk about the early church. And so you might ask, well, why are we even talking about Constantine? It's totally irrelevant, right? I mean, we just have Jesus, and we have the Bible, and we go to church on Sunday and praise and worship the Lord. You know, what do we need? What do we need to know and dig back into history and try to work our way through that? Well, it's important to know where Christianity has originated. Of course, in the New Testament, we see the record of the early church, and then its development and its challenges. One of the reasons I think a lot of people don't talk about church history is a lot of it is really depressing and discouraging to see how Christians have made mistakes, they've committed errors, they've been incompetent in leadership in many ways. They have made a mess of things. And so a lot of, especially the modern presentational churches, they want to sweep all in under the rug. And then when someone asks them, well, what about this happening 500 years ago? They say, well, yeah, that's history. We're a present-day contemporary church, and we only deal with the here and now and that kind of a thing. So you can understand why some people want to ignore history, but you can't ignore it. You have to know where you came from, your roots, for example. So John Stonestreet is really doing a good thing here in trying to educate people on Constantine. So let's get into his article, and then I'll comment on it. Constantine's turn to Christianity began before he abandoned Roman paganism. His children had been tutored by Lactantius, a Christian who opposed coerced worship and argued for religious liberty as long as religious practice did not disrupt public order. Years later, in 312, as Constantine went into battle against a rival, he claimed to have a vision of a symbol of Christ with the words, "In this sign conquer." He had his soldiers paint the symbol on their shields. Constantine won the battle and converted to Christianity. The following year, he issued the Edict of Milan, which declared religious liberty across the empire in terms that Constantine had learned from Lactantius. So this was a monumental moment in church history because before that time, the church had been persecuted on and off, sporadically and sometimes constantly. And then after it, Constantine said, no, Christianity can function in the free society, and we're not going to hunt down Christians and kill them. Constantine has been a controversial figure throughout church history. That's what I was talking about before, controversy. He is a controversial figure. Both the genius of his conversion and his impact on the church have been consistently questioned and scrutinized. Many think that Constantine's actions to tie the church to the empire compromised the gospel. This is the view of John Wesley, and I first learned of that from him when I was originally raised in United Methodist Church, and I began to dig into the background of the Methodist Church and find out what John Wesley believed and find out what his influences were. And I was learning about Constantine in a negative light before I ever heard about him in a positive light. The negative light was that he corrupted Christianity. He brought in all these pagans into the state religion. Well, it wasn't a state religion yet, but he was weakening and watering down the church for eventually it will be the legal religion of the Roman Empire. And so Wesley and some of the others, even D. James Kennedy in his Evangelism Explosion book, gives a summary of Constantine as a negative force because he basically flooded the church eventually with pagans and watering down the true gospel that we find in the New Testament. So that's what John Stonestreet is saying here. Many think that Constantine's actions to tie the church to the empire compromised the gospel. Often these arguments are based on a misunderstanding of what Constantine did and fail to consider what the followed from the legalization of Christianity. So Stonestreet is actually going to try to say, well, that's due to a misunderstanding. I'm not sure if that's an adequate refutation of Wesley and others, but let's read on. The Edict of Milan legalized Christianity along with other religions. It did not declare Christianity the official imperial religion, though Constantine's promotion of Christianity made it more popular. It was not named the imperial religion until Emperor Theodosius I in 380. Even then, Theodosius did not suppress paganism. So there's no question about it that Constantine favored Christianity. He believed that he won his battle and became the sole emperor through the sign of the cross, and by aligning with Jesus, the one in the vision, and putting the cross on the soldiers' shields, he believes that he won that battle and God favored him. And so now he was a promoter of Christianity. So you have the most powerful man in the Roman Empire, and the Roman Empire was the vast, huge empire, the biggest empire on the face of the earth at the time, had conquered many, many lands. And here you have the most powerful man in the Roman Empire, and he is officially endorsing and promoting Christianity. So it went from a persecuted, hiding out in the catacombs, and basically a opposed and persecuted group of Christians to all of a sudden they are now the most favored religious group in society, and they're being promoted, and Constantine is building church buildings for them and offering to translate scriptures for them. All kinds of benefits are coming the way of the church. Now, what did that do to the church? Was there compromise? Well, that's what John Wesley and lots of people think today, although the Eastern Orthodox people mainly, for example, in Russian Orthodox Church, the Greek Orthodox Church, and some of the other churches around the Middle East, they look to Constantine as a saint, and they see him as a hero and as a positive influence on Christianity. They don't see him as a corrupter of Christianity. But the problem is there is truth in both of these opinions. Yes, corruption did come into the church after Constantine began to shower it with blessings and promote it. And there was a mingling of church and state. And whenever you have power and position and money and resources thrown at something, you're going to get corruption. What is the old saying? Power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Well, you had this emperor who was the absolute power, and now he's promoting Christianity. So yeah, there's going to be corruption. Whenever you put pressure on people to become Christians or to favor Christianity, some are going to resent it, some are going to go along with it just for their own sake, but not because of their heart, that God has changed their heart. They're going to do it because it's more beneficial to go along with the program of the emperor than to oppose it. So it is a mixed bag. That's the thing. It is a mixed bag. There are pros and there are cons of Constantine's life. It says, despite what you may have read online or seen in the Da Vinci Code movie, Constantine did not dictate doctrine to the church. That is correct. He did not decide doctrine. There, you will run into some people who will tell you that Constantine was the one who decided how many books are in the New Testament, or Constantine decided that there was a Trinity, and Constantine did this, and No. He called together a council. That's what the next line here says, when he called the Council of Nicaea in 325 to deal with the question of the nature of Christ, a controversy that was threatening to tear the church apart, he was performing a traditional function of Roman emperors who often acted as mediators in religious conflicts. So he did call together a council of Christian leaders at Nicaea in the year 325, and he did pay for their way, I believe, paid for their housing and food, basically hosted this religious sit-down, and it was a very, very important meeting, and it still is a very, very important council. It's one of the councils that almost everybody who calls himself a Christian today will agree was a significant meeting and council in the first few centuries of the church. Even Eastern Orthodox, Roman Catholics, and Protestants can all agree on the Council of Nicaea because we accept the conclusions of the Council of Nicaea that Jesus is not just a created being, which is what the Arians, so-called Arians, believed, led by Arius of Alexander. He was trying to argue that Jesus was a lesser God than God the Father, and that he was a created being by God the Father, and so on and so forth. But when you look in the New Testament, you find, for example, 1 John 1:1, in the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And then verse 14 of the same chapter, it says, and the Word came to dwell among us. So it's speaking of Jesus. Jesus is the Word. So Jesus is God, and he's not a created God. He is not a lesser God. He is God, along with the Father and the Holy Spirit, the Trinity. So this was a very important meeting. So that was a good thing that Constantine did. He actually got Christians together, promoted a council, and basically let the leaders do what they wanted to do. He was not there to dictate what they should rule. And thankfully, at that meeting, at the Council of Nicaea, the incarnation of Christ, the true divinity of Christ, was upheld against the false heretics, which was a good thing. Despite claims to the contrary, neither Constantine nor the Council of Nicaea had anything to do with the formation of the canon of Scripture. Constantine did not control the discussion at Nicaea, nor did he dictate the outcome. And even if he had tried, many bishops who attended the council had been tortured by his predecessor, Diocletian. If they didn't compromise their faith then, it's silly to assume they would roll over for Constantine. So that's correct. So the meeting was not rigged by Constantine. He simply wanted there to be harmony in the empire. And you can imagine that's a good thing, to have harmony in the Roman Empire. And probably that was his chief motive, to try to bring unity and not allow disunity to prevail, which any leader would want, right? If you're a leader in your society and your nation, you don't want disunity, you want unity. You want things flowing and harmony, peace and harmony, right? And so Constantine called this council together. Well, it's a providential thing that he did. The Edict of Milan also furthered Christian evangelism. Prior to Constantine, the gospel had spread to India, Armenia, Persia, and then from Persia across Central Asia into China by the early 600s. The legalization of Christianity led to churches being founded across the Roman Empire and missionaries sent to regions outside the empire. St. Patrick was Romanized Briton who grew up as a Christian and brought the gospel to Ireland. In the 5th century, a Syrian Christian named Frumentius converted the king of Axum in modern Ethiopia. Together, they evangelized that kingdom. Cyril and Methodius brought the gospel to the Slavic people of Central and Eastern Europe in the 9th century. The evangelization of these regions can be traced to the actions of Constantine. Okay, now here's another controversial point. Historical leaders like John Wesley and others would say evangelism of a sort, but not true evangelism. Because what began to happen in the Roman Empire was it was safer and it was more advantageous, and there was pressure put on people to become Christians, to convert to Christianity, because that's the religion of the emperor. And so if you wanted to succeed in society, if you wanted to get ahead in life, if you wanted things to go well with you, you would live in harmony with the emperor. And so people came into the Christian church not because necessarily they had a heart change or the Holy Spirit had moved to convict them of their sins, or they had a passion and burning to follow Jesus Christ and live a holy life. No, one of the motivations that became dominant in the church was that they wanted to become full-fledged Roman citizens. And when you have the emperor a Christian and promoting Christianity, and then in 380, Christianity becomes the official Roman religion, then there is every incentive to join the church, whether you're converted or not, and every incentive to say that you're a Christian, whether you really are or not. And that's the corruption of the faith. And that's what John Wesley and others were criticizing Constantine for, was that he started this whole cycle of pagans becoming, quote, Christians and joining the church and becoming, quote, members of Christianity in the church. But really, were they genuine converts? Did they really have a saved soul? It's questionable. I mean, many did. Many were sincere, but many were not. So again, it's a mixed bag. Of course, the legalization of Christianity set up a tug of war between the church and state, because the faith had existed as an illegal and periodically persecuted minority religion for centuries. The church functioned fully independent of the state. With Constantine came new questions such as what properly belongs to Caesar and what belongs to God. Again, the mixing of the church and the state, and the power and the temptation to force people to either believe or at least profess certain things, or penalties. And it was at that time that the church began to, the state actually began to suppress heretics. And you began to see that after the Council of Nicaea, because the heretics were banished, oftentimes forcefully removed from the empire. And then when their views became more powerful in the political process, then the Orthodox bishops and priests were banished. And so this church-state power struggle began, and it's caused a mess. And thankfully today we have a lot of religious freedom, because one of the benefits of the Reformation was that the Anabaptists began to argue that there should be a strict separation of church and state. Why? Because they didn't want the state to be compelling people to believe in the Christian faith. Well, where did that compelling people to believe in the Christian faith start with in Christianity? It started actually with Constantine and things that led up to then 380, where the state religion became Christianity. So, yes, Constantine was instrumental in actually starting a confusion of the church and the state, and that was another negative thing. But then again, like John Stonestreet is arguing here, he helped further the spread of the gospel because he was actually promoting by printing Bibles, having Bibles translated, printing Bibles, building church buildings all over the place, sending missionaries places. So you have the emperors, Theodosius especially, like Theodosius the One, he began to not just allow Christianity, but to favor Christianity to the point where it became the official religion of the entire Roman Empire. So that was a mixed blessing, because, yeah, there were all kinds of benefits that came for Christianity, but then there were all the negatives too. that came to Christianity. And so you have to weigh one against the other. That is the big debate, and it's still going on. I don't think anyone has ever settled the debate. I think questions like, well, what would have happened if Constantine had not converted to Christianity and had not won his battle against his rival? And what if Christianity had continued to be persecuted by the Roman Empire and the old paganism? Well, a lot of bad things could have happened. Maybe Christianity would have remained just a regional Middle Eastern religion, and it wouldn't have spread very far. But on the other hand, maybe it would have become stronger and gotten stronger year after year because it wasn't corrupted by the state, by politicians, and power corrupts. And there was no question that Christianity, and especially the church, was corrupted by its association with the Roman Empire. Because if you look at the established church, which eventually, by the time of the Middle Ages and the Reformation time, had become this established entity, it looked a lot like the Roman Empire political structure. You had, for example, in the West, you had the Pope, and he looks a lot like the emperor. And then you had the bishops, and they look a lot like Roman officials. And then you look at the government between the Roman Catholic Church and the Roman Empire, and man, there are all kinds of similarities. So was the church influenced by the Roman Empire? Yes, no question. And by the time of the Reformation, it was a highly political thing too. So there was a lot of corruption that came into the church, but there were also a lot of blessings and benefits because the church was promoted and expanded, and through the grace of God, the doctrines, the core teachings, for example, of the Apostles' Creed and the Nicene Creed and some of the original creeds, they came through and they were preserved. And even though there was a lot of doctrinal development in the Roman Catholic Church and a lot of corruption and a lot of false teachings made their way into the official teachings of the Roman Catholic Church, the Bible was still preserved. And even with threats like from Islam and all kinds of other things, Christianity prevailed. So here we are in the 21st century, and we're looking back on Constantine and saying, okay, was he a net negative or a net positive? And again, it's really, really hard to say what he was. But I would tend to go with John Stonestreet and say that Constantine, with all of his faults and all of the negative things that he did bring into the church overall, historically, he was a net positive, I believe. And then it says here, question remains a central issue of Western political thought today. Even in view of the historical difficulties that have emerged from his conversion, we can thank God for Constantine and for the freedom for faith and the gospel he established. So, yeah, I would say that Constantine was a net positive. At the same time, he brought in a lot of problems, and we still are wrestling with the ramifications of these church and state problems that he brought in to Christianity by his conversion. So hopefully that's been a helpful summary, and we'll see you back next week. God bless.